Now listen up.
Coming to you from a toddler's playroom in the Lone Star State. Welcome to Health, Wealth, and a Taste of History, where we ramble and you listen. Bringing you weird history, food science, and the facts you didn't know you needed. Here are your hosts, Bob and Tom.
Hey historians, welcome back to another episode with Bob and Tom. Today, we're going to talk about sugar. What is it, where did it come from, and how did it shape history? And then, because it's Columbus Day or Indigenous Peoples Day, depending on where you're at, we'll also kind of go into the history of Columbus and how sugar played a big part in that. So, what is sugar exactly?
Sugar is just a word that describes any kind of a soluble, sweet-tasting carbohydrate. It could be table sugar or regular sugar, which refers to sucrose. And sucrose is a disaccharide. It's made up of fructose and glucose. I know that's a lot of oses, but just kind of bear with us here in a minute, because anything in it with ose is going to be a sugar, right?
Sugars are somewhat broken down into simple and complex sugars. So simple sugars are those that include the monosaccharides, like fructose, glucose, and galactose. And complex sugars include the disaccharides, like sucrose, lactose, and maltose, like Bob had just mentioned before.
Yeah, and sucrose is fructose and glucose, lactose is glucose and galactose, and maltose is glucose and glucose.
Another molecule of glucose, two molecules of glucose. So, funny story about lactose, in case you were wondering. Lactose comes from milk. It's also present in human breast milk. So, any animal that produces milk produces lactose.
Yeah, and the people that are intolerant to lactose, they don't actually make an enzyme in their body that's called lactase.
So, that enzyme helps people break it down?
Down, yes.
And so if you don't have that enzyme, that's what makes you lactose intolerant.
Yes, or gassy.
So what are some sources of sugars? So honey and fruits are the big sources of your natural simple sugars. And then sugar cane and sugar beets are where you get your sucrose or your table sugar. And just as a fun fact, in 2016, you have a little over 2 billion tons of sugar cane and sugar beets processed. Just to put it in perspective as to how important this stuff is. 2 billion tons. That's a lot of sugar.
Yeah, and up till a few hundred years ago, it was just cane sugar. Sugar beets weren't really into the big production picture.
So let's talk about some of these examples of sugar. So maltose. What is maltose? Maltose is just the sugar that you get from malting grains.
And lactose comes from the milk, including human breast milk, as we said before.
And then another big one is corn syrup. That's one of the ones you hear about nowadays all the time. That just basically comes from processing cornstarch into sugar molecules.
Yeah, and I believe that corn syrup has actually taken over table sugar, cane sugar, beet sugar.
Oh, I'm sure, yeah.
Corn syrup.
So let's talk about the history of sugar. And in order to talk about the history of sugar, we kind of have to start with sugar cane. So where did sugarcane originally come from? It started in what is now modern Papua New Guinea. And really it was grown for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. But it didn't really start being cultivated until about 4000 BC. That's when they started actually pressing it to get the juices out. Before that, it was basically just something that they chopped up and chewed on because they discovered that it was sweet. So cultivation really starts about 4000 BC in what's now modern Papua New Guinea. Then we're going to talk about how it spread across the world, how the medieval Islamic world was responsible for a lot of the spread of sugarcane, how it spread to the West Indies, mainly due to Columbus, and then how later on in history, very recent history, is when beet sugar and high fructose corn syrup come into play.
Yeah, 19th and late 20th century.
Mm-hmm. So what exactly is sugarcane? Well, it kind of looks a little bit like a bamboo almost, but it's a tall perennial grass in the genus Saccharum. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Typically, it's 2 to 6 meters tall, which is 6 to 20 feet, And it's just kind of this fibrous thing that grows, and it's rich in this sweet juice that people discovered and started cultivating.
It originates from Southeast Asia, where the cultivation began about 6,000 years ago. There's several different types. The Saccharum officinarum, it was originally cultivated in Papua New Guinea, and then it was selectively bred from a Saccharum robustum.
Yeah, so they had several different species, but they kind of settled on this officinarum because it was the sweetest. So that's why this one is important. And from that area, it kind of starts spreading north towards mainland Asia, Southeast Asia, and it also starts spreading into the Pacific. So you have this spread from Papua New Guinea into the Solomon Islands, to Vanuatu, Samoa, Tahiti, and then even eventually as far as Hawaii.
And how did they sail across those seas back then, that far back?
Who knows? Because some of these island chains are vast ocean distances apart.
Yes.
Then we have another variety that kind of is important in history, and this one originated in southern China, northern Vietnam, and Taiwan. And this one is Saccharum sinense.
Sensei.
And this one wasn't quite as sweet as officinarum, but that was just the local flavor that they had. But this one didn't really kind of transition to the rest of the world. It kind of stayed local to that area.
So then you have the other one, another one that's called Saccharum barbari. It was cultivated in East India and Bangladesh around 10,000 or 1000 BC. It began its spread by branching off toward Persia, which is modern-day Iran, and Madagascar, and then continued from Persia through ancient Levant and Egypt and goes over. And we'll talk about that in a little bit because that's where it is actually being picked up and driven across the Middle East during the Muslim conquest.
So, sugar. Why is it called sugar? The name kind of originates in ancient India. So as the ancient Indians began cultivating it, they figure out how to turn it into a crystalline form. And that's around that 1000 BCE mark. Although we don't know exactly when, but sometime around that. Again, prior to this practice, it was mostly chewed raw, or it was pressed for the juices. And the original Sanskrit word that the etymology of sugar kind of originates from is sarkara. I could be mispronouncing that, but sarkara. And this originally means grit or gravel. It kind of ends up meaning ground or candied sugar later on. So you kind of go from gravel to candied ground sugar.
I had one of the books I was reading about this. They talk about the Sanskrit, and these Sanskrit documents go back 1,500 to 2000 BC, and there's just a lot of information in there. And one of them, they actually talk about a government document. Yep, there was bureaucracy even that far back. And in the government document, it's listing out 5 different types of sugar that they have at that time. And one of them they call gur, G-U-R. And then another one is called Khandia, which is Khanda. But you can see where a lot of these English words are coming from.
So let's talk about how the sugar evolved from sarkara. So in ancient Sanskrit, you have sarkara, and then as sugar cane kind of moves towards the rest of the world, it kind of starts with the Arabic. So in the ancient Arabic language, it was sukar, S-U-K-K-A-R. And as it moves into the Latin world, you end up with sucarum. And then as it moves up towards Middle English and French, you end up with sucre, S-U-C-R-E. So you can kind of see how sugar starts off as sarkara and kind of slowly changes into what now we call sugar.
And then the scientific name, you can see where that comes from the Latin zucarum.
All right, so now that we have an understanding of sugarcane, the naming convention, kind of where it got started, let's talk about how it moved into the rest of the world and made an impact. So we have it starting in Papua New Guinea, and then the primary means towards the rest of the world was going through India. So It's hitting India at about 1,000 years BC, and then what happens?
And then you have Darius the Great from Persia invades parts of India around 500 CEE. And they'd already known a little bit about sugar back then, but when he gets there, they start to find out about the growing processes and the milling processes, and they bring it into Persia and start growing it themselves. And then 300 BCE, that you've got Alexander the Great moves all the way out to India, and that's about the point where his generals say, we've had enough. It's time that we stop fighting, and we want to just enjoy the money that we have.
Or that's kind of where they get their asses kicked.
Yeah, basically.
But yeah, as Alexander the Great is going through Persia and India, he's also seeing this sugarcane being cultivated. And there's actually a pretty interesting quote from one of his generals, Nearchus. He says, "A reed in India that brings forth honey without bees, from which an intoxicating drink is made, though the plant bears no fruit." And that's one of the earliest mentions of sugar kind of working its way west from the ancient East.
Yeah, you notice he's not talking about candy or candy bars. Everything was about alcohol with them back then.
Oh, yeah. So sugar's now moving into the modern-day Middle East, and the Greeks and Romans are starting to get aware of it. Now, they're not cultivating it quite yet, but they're starting to trade. Then we move into about 1000 BC into the 1st century AD, and that's really during the Greco-Roman time frame. And so in this time frame, sugar is a luxury. So it's really only for the rich, and then it's also considered a medicine. So there's actually a Greek physician, Dioscorides. I could be mispronouncing that again. But he wrote, "There is a kind of coalesced honey called sakcharon, found in reeds in India and Eudaimon, Arabia. Similar in consistency to salt and brittle enough to be broken between the teeth like salt. It is good dissolved in water for the intestines and stomach, and can be taken as a drink to help relieve a painful bladder and kidneys." And then also in Roman times, you've got another guy talking about sugar. This is another good quote. This is from Pliny the Elder. "Sugar is made in Arabia as well, but Indian sugar is better. It is a kind of honey found in cane, white as gum, and it crunches between the teeth. It comes in lumps the size of a hazelnut. Sugar is used only for medicinal purposes."
And that's kind of interesting too, because what they're doing is actually in these mills where they're producing it on the farm back then, it's coming out, and when they produce it, they put it into a block that kind of looks like a safety cone. It's wide on the bottom, pointy on the top, and they would knock little chunks off it like that and then sell it through the Silk Road.
Then we kind of move into the Muslim Arab world. So it was really around the 6th century AD, as Islam was just getting started. Arabs were going around conquering cultures and traveling and trading and doing all kinds of stuff. That's when you start to see the first industrialization of sugar production, where they're really building these big plantations with these large-scale mills. And this is all stuff that they learned from the Indians and then expanded upon. And one of the big things that they came up with was artificial irrigation for these plantations. And then they also took the mills that used to be separate locations and they put them on site. So it was all one big complex for sugar production, sort of.
Yeah, the Arab engineers were fantastic at irrigation and using technology that had been developed before, developing their own technology or just making it better. Like they would use the screw. Archimedes basically had discovered or actually invented that. And there was a university, actually, there was actually universities back then in the northern part of Iraq, and it was called Junda Shapar University. What you had was scholars that were from Arabia and Persia, but you also had a lot of scholars that were coming in from being basically persecuted and ran out of the Byzantine Empire and come over, and they have what they think is probably the first teaching hospital that's not military related, because we're pretty sure the Romans had one down in Alexandria. And they're doing a lot of research and writing about sugar and best methods for agriculture and produce some pamphlets, which you wouldn't think that's going to happen at this time, but it does. And they're handing them out to people and telling them, hey, look, this is a great crop, great cash crop. This is the best way to grow it. So it's pretty cool that all that stuff is happening around that time. And then by about 700, 800 AD, it reaches the Levant and Egypt. And Levant is, Lebanon and where
Iraq,
Syria, and all that is at today. And they say that the Egyptian mills had the best sugar of that time. They're producing sugar that's on par, supposedly, with India.
And as it kind of continues to move into the Western world, we see, especially due to the Muslim expansion, we see this sugarcane start to move into the Mediterranean, which is a more hospitable climate for it to grow in. I mean, the cane sugar plant, it requires quite a bit of water and good warm temperatures to thrive. So we start to see it move into Crete around 1000 AD, and then into some other islands throughout the Mediterranean. But the production really isn't that huge yet. All these European nations and North African nations are predominantly relying on trade still. They're not really producing a whole lot. It's getting started, but it's mostly reliant on Arab and Indian sugar coming in through trade.
About this time, what about the 10th all the way through the 13th and 14th century, what do you got going on? You got the Crusades. And so you have several actually nations, states, which are basically kingdoms that pop up that are Christian kingdoms down around Syria in the Levant area. And when they move in, they de facto basically pick up some of these sugarcane plantations, so they become more exposed to sugar, and this is the Crusaders. And they're trading with the big traders of the time, which was Venice and Genoa. And about the end of the 13th century is when you see the last of these kingdoms disappear. The Muslims run completely off. And so those few Templars, Knights Templars that were still down there, and some of the Venetian traders actually go to Crete, the kingdom of Crete, and set up probably the very first sugarcane plantation in the European Western world. And it's still, they find it to be very laborious. They had never actually done this before. And so it's a lot harder than what they think. It takes 9 to 18 months, usually around 12 somewhere months in there, for the sugarcane to come to maturity. You got to cut it off right at the time that it's mature. And you can cut it off at the stalk, right as the stalk's coming out of the ground, and hopefully get 2 to 3 more crops out of that. And then you take that to the mill. They got to take it as fast as they possibly can to the mill so that it can be crushed and the juice can be extracted before that juice ferments. Because then you're not going to have anything but some kind of wine. Later it becomes rum and a few other different things. And so you have these Crusaders and Venetian merchants that are actually the ones that do this, and they start to get a little better at it, and then they do another plantation on Sicily, and then it isn't till about around 1419. That's when the island of Madeira is claimed by the Portuguese. And they see, wow, this is a great little island. They brought some sugar in there and seen how great it grew. And then, before you know it, most of the island is actually producing sugarcane.
Up until this point, sugar is still expensive. Let's remember, it's still primarily through trade that these European nations are getting it. It was on par in price to spices like nutmeg, ginger, cloves, and pepper, which all had to be transported across the Indian Ocean still at the time. So it's getting more and more in Europe. Like Bob was saying, they started harvesting and cultivating in Madeira, and then they also start spreading to the Canaries and Cape Verde Islands, where there's plenty of water. The climate is very hospitable for sugarcane cultivation. But now, as they're getting more and more cultivation going, they start running into a problem. It is a lot of work.
Yeah.
Because it's a lot of work, what do?
They start looking for slaves.
Yep.
And until 1453, that's when the Constantinople actually fell, and then the Ottoman Empire controlled the whole region. Until about that time, Venetian and Genoese merchants were getting slaves from the Byzantine Empire, who were getting slaves from the Slavic states. So this is where you get the word slave. It comes from Slavs, slaves, Slavs. And once this closes down, they have lost their line on these slaves, so they start looking for slaves elsewhere. And the Moors are more than happy to sell them slaves from Africa. And this is where you start seeing some of the first African slaves being used on sugar farms, or sugar plantations, excuse me.
And also, as the fall of Constantinople happens, what else happens? Basically, the Silk Road is cut off. So this, what is now a high-prized commodity in Europe, this sugar, is essentially, a lot of the trade is cut off. Now there's a mad rush. We got to produce this. We got to find a way to do this. What can we do? Let's get some laborers, like Bob was saying. And now this is where you're kind of seeing some of this African slave trade start.
Yeah, but you've also squeezed off that trade in pepper, nutmeg, cinnamon, silk. So the people in Europe start thinking about, how do I get to Asia without going through the Muslim Empire?
That kind of brings us into the next thing we're going to talk about, Columbus, because obviously it's Columbus Day, or Indigenous Peoples Day. Christopher Columbus was not always known as Christopher Columbus. He was Genoese, and in the Ligurian language that was spoken at the time, his original name was actually Cristoforo Colombo. And then in Italian, it ended up transitioning to Cristoforo Colombo. And, now we know him as Christopher Columbus. But why is Christopher Columbus important at this point? Obviously, we know that he sailed the ocean blue. He's pursuing this avenue of getting to Asia in a different way, which is a mad race between all these European states. How are they going to get there so they're not relying on basically the Middle East?
Yeah, the only way to do it is sail across the Atlantic Ocean. Which, contrary to popular belief, most people at that time didn't think that the world was flat. They weren't flat earthers. They knew the earth was round. And this actually goes back to Greco-Roman times, when the circumference of the earth was figured out and pretty close. And then you got Columbus, who starts looking at all these different maps and reading all that he can. It's him and his brother, actually, Bartholomew, that are looking at this, and they begin to start doing their own calculations.
One of the maps that they were specifically looking at was actually drawn or written by this astronomer named Paolo dal Pozzo Toscanelli. And he created this map in 1474. So obviously he didn't know for sure, but he posited that there should be a route from Europe across this large water mass to Asia. And that's kind of when this idea was born. And that's when Columbus kind of picks up on it and they start pitching it.
They go to Ferdinand and Isabella around 1486 is the first time they start pitching it. But what's going on in Spain at that time is they're still trying to drive the last of the Moors out of Spain. That's the last of the Muslims out of Spain. So they're spending a lot of money down that way. So they don't really have the money to give him at the moment. And, instead of just totally sending him away, though, which most people think that that's what happened, actually, they kind of put him on retainer.
And part of the reason that they weren't quite ready to support his endeavors yet was because this other guy named Bartholomew Diaz, what he did was he actually sailed around the southern tip of Africa, around the Cape of Good Hope, and discovered a southern route. Because there was a route already kind of discovered, the king and queen were a little hesitant to fund it right away.
And he was Portuguese, was he not? Or doing it for the Portuguese.
He was doing it for the Portuguese, I believe,
Yeah.
So they're a little hesitant, but they do put him on basically a retainer. So basically Columbus is just getting paid to be on standby at this point. And after several years of this, and several years of back and forth, they agree in April of 1492 to sponsor a voyage. This is called the Capitulations of Santa Fe. And it's kind of a sweet deal that Columbus got from the king and queen here. So these are some of the promises they made. He would earn the title of Admiral of the Ocean Sea. He would be named viceroy and governor of any new lands that he could claim for Spain. He gained the right to nominate 3 people, with the monarchs choosing one of those 3, to any post he wanted in the new lands. He would be entitled to 10% of the profits from any new lands in perpetuity, and then he would have the option of purchasing a 1/8 stake in any new business ventures and would therefore receive a 1/8 of the profits. So basically, he would be the first offered an investment opportunity. When I saw the in perpetuity part, it made me think of Shark Tank with all the Mr. Wonderful deals where he wants a royalty in perpetuity.
There's a little backstory that's going on there too at that time where Isabella has they call it a confessor. It's basically like her treasurer. He tells Isabella, no, this is not a good idea, that he doesn't really think they can actually do it. But Ferdinand and his confessor and some of the other people he has actually believes that he can do it and thinks this is a great idea. So anyway, basically they convince Isabella, who sends the guard out, goes finds Columbus on his way out and brings him back and sets him up on all of this. And some of the people that are actually backing this venture have somewhat of a background to them. You have this gentleman named Bernardi that is a representative for the Medici Bank, which are these incredibly rich people at the time in Venice, I believe it is, the Venetian. Mm-hmm. And this is before Italy was actually a country. This where most of these cities were just big city states, and they were ran by business people. There wasn't any royalty per se, that these people are just super, super fantastically rich and do a lot of different things. So this guy is being backed by them, and he's loaning out money in their name, at pretty high interest rates. But he's also got this side business. He's a slaver. So you got the guy that's loaning money for this venture as a slaver. And he also put some money in another venture that's going on behind the scenes. The Canary Islands had been conquered for the most part by this time, and they were growing a lot of sugar out of there. But there was 2 more major islands that hadn't capitulated yet. So about the same time that Columbus leaves Spain, he stops in the Canary Islands for 30 days, and they do some repair work to the Pinta because the rudder fell off, and a few other things are going on. But there is this planning stage for invading this La Palma Island. Mm-hmm. It involves, like I said, these people. And also, one of the people that it involves is that very confessor to Ferdinand that said, hey, this is a pretty good idea. We're going to convince Isabella, is one of the people who have money in this invasion and also have money in Columbus's voyage. What do they stand to gain if they invade these 2 other islands? Well, it's more property that they can grow sugar on, and also bring more slaves in, because the slave trade and the sugar trade go hand in hand, and it was getting quite lucrative at the time. The trade winds come right off of Africa, go right over the Canary Islands, and go across the Atlantic. And that's what Columbus picks up from the Canary Islands, and pretty sure that's going to take him all the way to Asia.
Yeah, he had an understanding of the trade winds that wasn't really common knowledge at the time. So that's kind of an advantage he had versus anybody else.
You're listening to Health, Wealth, and a Taste of History with Bob and Tom. We'll be right back.
So now we get into his first voyage, which is the famous one. It's this first of 4 round-trip voyages, actually. And this one kicks off in 1492. Because of his knowledge of the trade winds and the fact that he had already been an experienced sailor doing lots of trading all across Europe. He did a lot of trading with England and Ireland, actually, for the kingdoms down in the Mediterranean. So he had a good knowledge of what he was doing. So he sails and sails and sails, and it was sometime around October 11th or October 12th that the expedition first hit land. And the first land that they hit was actually the modern-day Bahamas. He named that first island San Salvador, which meant Holy Savior. Mm-hmm. So they hit these this first island, they kind of bounce around, which is the modern day Bahamas, and then they move on to what's modern day Cuba. They kind of explore the northeastern coast, so they kind of land in the middle, kind of head along the northeastern coast to the eastern tip of Cuba, and then off to Hispaniola, which is modern day Haiti and the Dominican Republic.
And that's where they set up their settlement they're going to have. But it actually isn't at that time. What happens is, by this time he's already lost the Pinta. It had ran aground. So they're down to 2 ships. They get to Hispaniola, they meet the local natives, and they seem to be getting along quite well. By this time, he's plundered gold from some other natives, and then gets these natives to actually give him some gold. And they're giving him food and everything else. And the natives are coming out, and for the most part, they're not wearing clothes like the Europeans do. You got to think about it at that time. Europeans, they bathe maybe once a week, if that, which is pretty disgusting. You got all of these men, been on this boat for a couple of months.
I think it was like heavy 5-6 weeks, something like that.
These big, heavy clothes that they're used to wearing in Europe, and they got to just smell horrible. And so these natives are coming up, and they might have some skins on. They may not. It's hot. It's Hispaniola, right? And they're giving them food. And so what happens is, at this time, Columbus decides that they need to get back to Spain, and he leaves 30, I believe it's 30 of these men.
Something like that, yeah, 30,
behind.
30-ish.
They build a little small fort or whatever, and he leaves these 30 men behind and talk to the chief. He had a native with him that was kind of helping them translate it. They had taught the natives some of their the Spanish language, and then they were able to basically get enough across between each other that they could trade, and then kind of get the idea across that he's going to leave these guys here. The chief says yes, and then he picks up easterly winds, which another trade winds going to the east and the currents going to the east. This is before all of this stuff is known and being wrote down anywhere about the currents. Was it luck? Aliens, or did he just have some kind of prior knowledge? Who knows?
Yeah, maybe a little bit of everything.
Anyway, so he gets back to Spain, and he brings back with him a turkey, a pineapple, and 3 natives.
And some gold.
And some pearls, I think, maybe, but it's a little bit of gold. It's not much gold, but it's a little bit of gold. And then tells this fantastic story about Eden and paradise, and gold is everywhere. And then quickly he becomes a celebrity all throughout Europe, because if anything, he was probably his best self-promoter, right? And you got the printing press by then, so pamphlets and books are pretty common. I won't say very common, but pretty common. It's more common than it used to be, and word spreads very fast, especially about this kind of a trip.
All right, and that takes us into Columbus's second voyage, which was from 1493 to 1496. So the first voyage, he sailed with 3 ships, and due to the success and the stories that came from that first trip, this time he actually set sail with 17 ships and 1,200 men. They carried enough supplies to start establishing permanent colonies. Some of the people that he brought with were priests, farmers, and obviously soldiers, who would wind up becoming these permanent settlers. And there's a little bit of debate at this point, because they had black Africans as part of that 1,200 men. But the slave trade to the New World wasn't quite established yet. So there's a little bit of debate on whether during this voyage they were still free black Africans or if they were slaves.
Yeah, because you already had the slave trade going on, especially on the Canary Islands. But there were the Moors, the Muslims, were racially diverse and fairly well educated. And so you had a lot of people employed in different places, different races, in that Mediterranean area at different times doing different things. So there is some debate going back and forth about that. Now, one of the things that Columbus brings with him on this voyage is the sugar cane. He brings the first stalks of the sugar cane. And the aim of his whole voyage the stated purpose was to convert the natives to Christianity. And this was from Isabella and Ferdinand, but also the Catholic Church when they gave their blessing or the trip was that they would bring back many converts to Christianity.
So this expedition actually landed a little further south this time. So the first island that they hit was Dominica, and this is on the eastern Caribbean. And so they start working their way up. They basically island hop from Dominica up through Guadalupe, Nevis, St. Croix, the Virgin Islands. Then they move on to Puerto Rico, Hispaniola, Jamaica, and then Cuba. So they hit quite a few places on this expedition. Now, one of the big differences is, while the first expedition was relatively peaceful, this one is when they start getting into some skirmishes with the natives, particularly in St. Croix, Puerto Rico, and Hispaniola. Remember, Hispaniola was where he had left those 30 settlers that first time.
And they weren't alive when he got back, or when he came back. So he's a little upset. I would say that his men are probably a little upset as well. This lasted from 1493 to 1496, so there was a lot of stuff going on in between. But so what he does do in 1495 is he takes prisoners. God knows exactly how many he killed before he took the prisoners, but he sends some 500 prisoners back to Spain, and 200 of them die en route. And when they get back to Spain, Columbus isn't there. He's still back in the New World, but he isn't in Spain when this ship arrives. And when it arrives, Isabella is mortified by the fact that he had taken prisoners and he was trying to sell them, or people were trying to sell them for him because he needed to settle the debt with Bernardi about losing Pinta. And so Isabella wasn't going to allow that to happen. Neither was the church. These were supposed to be Spanish citizens, and they were supposed to be converts. And so she does put some of them, it doesn't say all of them, it just says some of them, back on a ship and sends them back to the New World. I'm not exactly sure what happened to the other. Did they just stay? I don't know.
Who knows? As all that's going on, Columbus, like Bob said, is still in the New World. So one of the things that happens is he establishes another settlement in Hispaniola. This time it's a permanent settlement, where he reigns as leader. He starts a gold mine on the island and also begins implementing what's called encomienda, which is basically him saying, I will protect you with my men and my guns and my technology, but you're going to be forced into labor for me, particularly mining gold and things like that. And this is also when the settlers start taking some of the natives as slaves, even including some of the children. Right before Columbus actually heads back, so this is again in 1495, he also falls ill for quite a while. There's a little bit of debate on what illness he caught, but it lasts for quite some time, several weeks and months. And while he's ill and recuperating, things get a little crazy without the leader around. So some of the settlers start stealing, killing, raping, and torturing natives. The torturing was basically, they were trying to force them to divulge locations of gold, because they still believed that there was gold everywhere, all over the place, even though on some of these islands there was not that much. But they're trying to torture them to give up these secret locations, as they think, and it's not looking pretty. It's estimated that some 50,000 perished during this time while Columbus was ill and recuperating before he headed back to Spain.
Yeah, so kind of getting back to this tribute system that Columbus imposes then, what he does is all residents that are above 14 years of age were required to find and deliver a specific quota of gold every 3 months. Upon their doing so, they would receive these little copper tokens that they wear around their necks. And any Indian or indigenous persons found without a copper token had their hands cut off and subsequently bled to death. And since there were no gold mines on the island, the Indians had no chance of meeting Columbus's quota, and thousands are pretty much reported to have committed suicide or just died on their own. And that's not even to speak about, by this time, you've got natives beginning to die from diseases that the Spanish and other Europeans are bringing over, and also their animals are bringing over, and the livestock. And not to mention just the damage that because pigs weren't even indigenous to the Americas at all. And once they hit the land, it's fertile virgin land to them, and the pig population explodes. And by about 150 years later, they're all the way up into North America. And one of the other things, too, is horses. The horses get loose And there's more horses that get loose on other voyages from other Spaniards and Portuguese as well. But by a couple hundred years later, they're all the way up into North America, and the plains Native Americans are learning how to ride them. So there's a lot of other species of plants that come in that aren't indigenous to America that are basically invasive species of plants. A dandelion and the freaking earthworm. That's one didn't know about. I was pretty shocked about. That was actually brought in as an invasive species.
The more you know. Okay. Well, I guess we'll move on to his third voyage then. So he returns to Spain, and obviously there's another voyage coming on. So his third voyage lasts from 1498 to 1500. And this time he leaves with a stated objective by King John II of Portugal. So there is word on the street that there's a continent over in this area, in this new world, that's supposed to be southwest of the Cape Verde Islands. So one of Columbus's primary objectives is to see if he can discover this continent. This time he leaves with 6 ships. 3 of the ships went straight to the settlement in Hispaniola as a resupply, and then he took the other 3 searching for this continent. So they headed further south than they had previously gone before, and they first land in what's modern-day Trinidad. And then they head on to what is modern-day Venezuela at the mouth of the Orinoco River. And this is where they realized that they did find this continent, South America. They discover it. They see that from the mouth of this river that there is a large landmass here. Now, the weird thing is at the time, they still think they're somewhere in Asia. They haven't figured out that this is an entirely new continent. They think that they're just discovering new portions of Eastern Asia at this point. They don't realize that there's a multiple 1,000-mile Pacific Ocean still in the way, and that they're nowhere near where they thought they were.
Yeah, because this whole idea of this continent that King John of Portugal had was because his navy, after the subsequent preceding voyages of Columbus, his navy was already starting to probe South America and find ways around. And there's kind of an interesting story, because there's a parallel story that's going on here. Is after that first voyage, you have another Genoese, what would you call him, adventurer?
Sure.
Goes to England, John Cabot, and tells the English king there that he could find Asia, and he thinks it's quicker to go around the northern top of the globe, and he'd be able to find that passage. Well, he lets him go, gives him some money, gives him some ships. He goes over, he does find North America, and then comes back. Upon finding out about this, the Portuguese king was pretty pissed off, because there had been a treaty during this time signed between Spain and Portugal, which basically the Catholic Church had allowed Spain and Portugal to split up the New World between them. Mm-hmm. No other countries were allowed, just those two. And so you have Portugal actually starting to make their forays into South America about this time as well. So they know there's a landmass there.
And funny thing happens, actually. During this third voyage, he
kind of runs afoul of the government there. When he gets back from probing the continent, mm-hmm. right? He gets back to Hispaniola. There's a little bit of a revolt going on. The guy that he had left behind as mayor is having some serious disagreements with Columbus's 2 brothers, Diego and Bartholomew. And so Columbus is having to kind of sort all this out. Spends a couple of months. He finally capitulates a little bit. And then he sends a letter back to Spain on one of the ships saying that he needs a little help. They need to send him a governor to kind of help him out, right? The crown sends back a gentleman by the name of Francisco de Bobadilla. Now, I'm going to butcher these names up, and I apologize. And he is a member of the Order of Calatrava. And they're basically like an order of the Knights Templar. They're kind of the same thing. So you have a gentleman that's a knight. He's an extremely devout Christian, and he's sent back to find out what's going on in Hispaniola. He didn't come alone. He's sent there with 500 men, and he brings back several repatriated Indians with him as well. And so when he gets to Hispaniola, he starts to side with the people who are rebelling, because he's starting to hear about all the stuff that Columbus did. Basically, on the day that he lands, there have been 5 Spaniards that that got hung, and they had several more waiting to be hung. And then he starts hearing about, of course, he lets those guys go and says that this is not going to happen, and he starts hearing about more atrocities.
Yeah, like the torture and killing and
torture
stuff
and
like
killing, yeah, and that they're skimming money and all this kind of stuff. And so what he does is he goes and he seizes all of Columbus's assets and arrest him and his brothers and put them in chains. And they send him back to Spain, where he actually sits. All three of them sit in jail for about 3 months, waiting to get audience with the king. When they finally do, he pleads his case, and the king says, "Oh, okay, yeah, you're all right. You can do everything, but you get all your titles back except for you can't be governor anymore."
And I think he's not allowed to return specifically to Hispaniola.
Yeah, he's.
So he's still Admiral of the Seas or Emperor of the Seas or whatever he is. He can do everything else. He's just not allowed to be a governor of anything, and he's not allowed to go back to that one island.
Yeah, so this is the end of 1499, 1450 or something like that, or 1500. And so he's not the most popular person in Europe now. There's a lot of things being spread about him. But the Genoese and the Venetian, Florentine, traders that are in the merchants that are in Spain at that time still back him up and still think he's a great guy and he's done some fantastic things. Which is surprising to me is that after all this happens, a few years later, with him doing lots of back talking and lots of schmoozing, he gets a fourth voyage.
Yep, he does. He gets a fourth voyage, and this one is from 1502 to 1504. So this time he sets off, and remember, he's not supposed to go to Hispaniola.
And he's only supposed to look for that passage to India, and he takes his 13-year-old son with him.
So once he is sailing, he hits the Caribbean. One of the things, though, along the route is that he sees a hurricane brewing, so that kind of changes the path he's trying to take. So he heads for Hispaniola, but he's denied portage there. So he moves on.
He goes to the other side of the island and then lays anchor and basically gets caught in the storm, but they've anchored off the coastline there. Their ships lose their anchors and get pushed out to sea, get banged around quite a bit, but basically they survive. But in the meantime, this Bobadilla guy who told him, "No, you cannot come back to Hispaniola. You stay out there. He's saying there's no hurricane coming." He's saying all of this because he has 30 ships ready to sail back to Spain, and he jumps on one of them, and another ship, probably the most rickety one of them all, has 10 million in gold that belongs to Columbus and the rest of Columbus's assets. And once they get out to sea, the hurricane hits. 20 of the ships sink. There's 500 people that are lost. And one of the only ships that actually make it and go all the way back to Spain is the one that has Columbus's gold on it. Yeah. Which will be wrapped up in litigation for the next 200 years.
Yeah, well, and we'll get to that point. Yeah. So, Columbus, he's not allowed to port in Hispaniola. He weathers out the storm, and he moves on. So, he actually hits Central America at this point. First he hits one of the islands off of the coast of Honduras, and then he hits mainland Honduras. And he starts exploring his way down. So he starts from Honduras, hits Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and then works his way down to Panama. And while he's exploring Panama, from the natives he learns of this passage, this strait through to another ocean by way of rivers and lakes and all this stuff. So I believe they do try to explore it, but the ship that they take ends up stuck in a river or something like that. So they don't actually make it through to the Pacific Ocean.
I think they get attacked by the native chief that told him about it, but also told him not to go up the river. Escapes, gets some more of his people, and they come back and they attack Columbus while they're trying to go up the river. And it doesn't work out too well for him.
Yeah, so he doesn't actually make it to the Pacific, but he does learn of a route through to another ocean. And at this point, he takes back off. So,
not having good luck.
Yeah, again, as he takes back off, there's another storms are hitting, and there's ship issues and all kinds of stuff going on. So he heads back. He tries to head back to Hispaniola, which is kind of like the main area. We keep coming back to it. That's kind of the main stepping off point here in the Caribbean. But he hits a strong storm and ends up stranded on Jamaica. They get stranded there for about a year. And during this time, One of his crew members, a Spaniard, he takes some of the natives. They try to launch a canoe expedition to go look for help. They do end up getting word to the governor of Hispaniola at the time, but he didn't like Columbus that much, so he started obstructing rescue efforts. So basically, they get stuck there for about a year until help actually arrives, and then he's finally able to return to Spain. And that was his final expedition. He didn't leave again after that.
And I think what happens is actually the guy that paddles the canoe all the way back, which you gotta say that's pretty badass right there, being able to paddle a canoe from Jamaica to Hispaniola.
I think they went to Cuba first. But somehow they ended up getting word to the governor in Hispaniola.
And the governor there at this time, he's it's not Bobadilla, because he was killed. It's a different governor, and he can't stand Columbus either. And so they get tired of Columbus's man gets tired of kind of waiting around, and basically winds up having a sword fight, a duel with the mayor there, and he wins. The mayor loses, and he allows the mayor to live, but he just says, hey, we got to go back and get Columbus. And so they finally do. They go get Columbus and bring him back to Hispaniola. And this is how much they can't stand the guy. They force him, and they've been on the island by shipwrecked, right, for over a year, him and his son and a few other crew members. And so they get back to their first area that looks like civilization. And to them, I think they're going to come back to this great warm welcome because he's a fantastic hero. Now they make him pay for him and his son passage back to Spain.
That's wild.
And so he gets back to Spain. He's his fame is
diminished at this point.
Diminished at the time. 2 years later,
May 20th, 1506.
He passes away.
He dies, in Spain.
And it's his son that writes his biography and also takes the crown to court, trying to get his money and some of the things he was promised back from them.
Yeah, because after his final voyage, remember that 10% of the profits that he was promised in the beginning? Well, he never gets it. So after that final voyage, he actually goes and tries to fight with the Spanish crown. They refuse him for various reasons. After his death, his children keep basically trying to sue them, and it's unsuccessful. After his final voyage, he kind of settles down in Valladolid, Spain. I'm butchering the name, sorry. But he settles down. He kind of becomes more religious in his later years. He often speaks about how many natives he was responsible for converting to Christianity. That's kind of a big talking point of his. And he writes 2 books. So
he doesn't talk about how many he sent to go meet their maker, right?
No, they only talk about the good stuff. But he did write 2 books. He wrote the Book of Privileges and the Book of Prophecies.
Wow.
So those are 2 of his works that he accomplished. Yeah, and then he passes.
On that, one thing I forgot to mention here was on that last voyage, when he's down there, he meets the native chief that tells him about the river. They think they're probably Mayan with background. And they actually introduce him to cocoa. So this is when he finds out about cocoa.
Oh, yeah, I forgot about that. He did find him.
Yeah, I just thought about that.
The cacao bean, cocoa bean, whatever it is.
Yeah, so he's responsible for bringing that back. And there's so many other things, too, that come back from the Americas to Europe.
So we talked about Columbus for a while now. So let's get back to sugar. So we talked about Columbus and his sailing 1492, all that good stuff. And on his second voyage, he brought sugarcane with him. So by 1520, there are over 3,000 sugar mills in the New World.
And a lot of those, the large majority of those are in Brazil. The Portuguese are running them, and also the Dutch, which is something you don't hear a whole lot about. But the Dutch become very big in the sugar business in later years to come. A lot of this sugar is being grown and milled down to a certain state, and then they're sent back to either Antwerp, London, Seville, Paris, one of the big cities, to be completely refined, because they had moved their refineries at that time back into Europe, so they could control it. They can control the trade.
Now let's finish this episode by talking about the not so nice and negative impacts of what happened as a result of Columbus's voyages to the Americas. So the first voyage or two, they weren't really bringing slaves with them. They were bringing indentured servants from Europe. Now, the problem was that these indentured servants did not have very good immunity to malaria and yellow fever. So about two-thirds of them were dying from illness. And it was kind of hard to get more to come over. I mean, and these indentured servants, basically what was happening is they had debts to wealthy people in Europe, and they were trying to pay them off. So they would sign up for a year contract, 2-year contract, whatever it was, to pay off their debts, come to the New World and work.
And from time to time, you see it later on where they'll just basically clean out the prisons by sending people over. And during the British were good about that too. During the British Revolution during the 1640s, 1650, just clearing out the prison, sending over people with less than savory backgrounds to the New World.
And then this transition happens, like we were talking about, because of the fact that these indentured servants were dying at such high numbers from malaria and yellow fever. They started bringing over Africans. As Africans have more of a natural immunity to those specific illnesses. And then also, if they bring over African slaves, they can't really campaign for their own living conditions. They can't really organize and complain. So it's a different sort of labor pool.
Yeah, and unfortunately, too, they were making huge amounts of money. They already knew that it was very lucrative from the trades that they were doing in the Madeira and the Canary Islands. And then you get this, what they call the trifecta, where the slaves were being imported from Africa into the Canary Islands, then brought down to South America and the islands. And then the items that were being produced there, mostly sugar and some cotton and tobacco, would be sent back to Europe, France, Spain, England, where they would be changed into some type of textiles, or the sugar would be refined even more, and then the ships would go back down to the Canary Islands, pick up more slaves, and go back to the Americas. And you just had this trade that was going on that were making these Europeans all rich.
And from what I read, the total number was something along like 18.5 million Africans were brought over during the times of the Atlantic slave trade to the New World.
Yeah, the last thing I read was by around 1880. I know this is a few hundred years later, but by around 1880, they were saying that about 18.5 million Africans that were either the parents or grandparents of slaves that were brought over.
That's a crazy number.
And it's pretty horrible when you think about it all, because the majority, or large majority of them, would die on the slave trader ships on the way over.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they would die on the way over, or
soon after getting
yeah,
and be totally worked to death.
And then one of the other really, really negative impacts as well of Columbus's voyages is the introduction of new illnesses to the Americas.
Yeah, you got a lot of diseases that come from the old world to the new world, and the indigenous people had no natural immunity to it, and it basically just devastates the population. And they're saying somewhere around the 1650s that 90-95% of the indigenous population was wiped out. And there's a lot of new studies going on today based off of genetics that are blowing a lot of the old history out of the water about what was going on in the Americas prior to Columbus, but saying that there were 60 million or more indigenous people in the United States. Pretty huge population. And then you think about the decline, that's 40 million people or more.
40, 50, yeah. I mean, that's a ton of people.
Just absolutely devastating.
Dying from smallpox and certain types of influenza that were being brought over. Yeah. But recently they've kind of figured out, or they're estimating that about 80% of the indigenous people that died from illness, it was actually due to salmonella, which was primarily brought over through the livestock.
Salmonella enterica paratyphi C, which was a zoonotic disease that was probably brought over with some of the animals that they brought in, and then being transferred into the animal herds and then into the people there. And this was a study that was done fairly recently of some skeletons that were found around the Aztec Empire town of Teotihuacan, or I cannot pronounce that.
Tenochtitlan, however you say
it
that
up really bad.
But, the capital city.
They found it on the scrapings of teeth, which is pretty crazy when you think about it. It's several hundred years back.
Well, all right. I think that's going to finish up this episode. Thank you, everybody, for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you. Bye.
You've been listening to Health, Wealth, and a Taste of History with Bob and Tom.
That was radical!
The #1 audio production for people with nothing better to do.
That was amazing.
For more info, head over to healthwealthandhistory.com. Thanks for listening, and until next time.